The trembling at the doors. The storm that rolled over the village of Ashwick that night was unlike anything old Willem had ever seen in his 60 years of living. It did not arrive the way honest storms arrived, with a grumbling of distant thunder, a darkening of the afternoon sky, a smell of rain that gave a man enough warning to bring in the firewood and latch the shutters properly. Those were storms Willem understood. He had lived through dozens of them in this same cottage, in this same armchair with this same fire, and he had learned long ago that a good storm was simply weather expressing itself loudly, nothing more frightening than a neighbor having a difficult evening. This storm was different in a way that Willem felt before he saw it. He had been sitting quietly, the last of the autumn light fading beyond his small window, when something shifted in the air of the room itself, a pressure, a thickness, as though the cottage had drawn a breath and not yet decided to release it. The fire, which had been burning with its usual cheerful steadiness, stuttered once, not from a draft. The windows were shut, the door was bolted. The fire simply stuttered, the way a candle flame will shiver when something unseen passes too close, and then it recovered and burned on, but somehow it was not quite the same fire it had been a moment before. The light it cast was the same light, the warmth the same warmth, but Willem, who had spent 60 years learning to pay attention to small things, noticed that even the shadows in the corners of the room had changed their quality. They were deeper now, more deliberate. He set down his book. Outside, the first sound came, not thunder or not thunder as he knew it. It was lower than thunder, longer, a sound that started somewhere beyond the hills to the north and rolled toward Ashwick like something enormous turning over in its sleep. The windows in their frames made a faint, high noise in response, a frequency that Willem felt more in his back teeth than heard with his ears, and the cup of cider on his side table trembled just slightly so that the surface of the liquid shivered in concentric rings before settling again. Then the lightning came. Willem had seen lightning in every configuration a Yorkshire sky could produce over 6 decades. He had seen the fork lightning that split the dark in a single clean fracture, and the sheet lightning that lit the whole horizon white, and once, memorably, the ball lightning that had drifted across the lower field like a slow, luminous thought before vanishing into the elm at the fence line and taking half its branches with it. He thought he had seen what lightning was capable of. The lightning that opened the sky above Ashwick that night was none of those things. It came in colors. Not the blue-white of ordinary electrical discharge, but colors that had no settled names, something between violet and a shade deeper than violet, a green that was almost not green, a red at the outermost edges that shaded into something the eye tried to follow and then simply gave up on. It did not fork cleanly. It branched and branched again, spreading across the clouds in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost structured, the way frost patterns a window with what looks, in certain lights, like intention. Each strike lasted a fraction of a second longer than lightning should, as though whatever was producing it was not quite subject to the usual rules of how long a thing like that was permitted to go on. The thunder that followed was not loud so much as it was everywhere. It did not crack. It pressed into the walls of the cottage, into the floor beneath Willem's feet, into the armchair's old cushions, into Willem himself, a deep concussive weight that lasted several seconds and left behind a silence that was somehow louder than the sound had been. Willem sat very still. He was not, by nature or by long habit, a man who frightened easily. He had buried a wife and outlasted 2 of his closest friends, and managed 40 years of farming in ground that had tested him every single season, and all of that had given him a relationship with difficulty that was more tired familiarity than fear. When hard things happened, Willem's first instinct was not to panic but to assess, to look at the situation plainly, determine what needed doing and do it without excessive ceremony. But sitting in his armchair while the sky outside performed something that had no natural name, Willem found that the word *assess did not quite cover what he was doing. He was, more precisely, waiting. For what, he couldn't have said. But the feeling that had settled into the room along with the changed quality of the shadows was not the feeling that preceded an ordinary event. It was the feeling, and Willem, who read widely and thought carefully, had a word for it, had encountered the concept in enough books to recognize it now in person. It was the feeling of a threshold, of something about to tip from one state of being into another. He waited. The wind arrived next, and it was the wind that carried the sound that finally articulated what the whole evening had been trying to say. It was not the wind's usual vocabulary, not the whistle through the gap under the back door, not the low moan around the chimney stack, not the percussive slap of a loose shutter. This wind had something else inside it, something braided into the gusts the way a voice is braided into breath. A sound that was deeper than the storm itself, present beneath the lightning and the rolling pressure thunder, a sound that Willem could only describe to himself later as grief with weather in it. Like a mountain trying to weep. Like something vast and not entirely of this world expressing, through the only medium available to it, an extremity of distress. He pulled his wool blanket up to his chest. The fire burned, the cider steamed. Outside, the storm raged in its impossible colors, and Willem sat in the reliable warmth of his living room and listened to something he had no framework for, and waited to understand what was being asked of this evening. He didn't have to wait long. The knock, when it came, was not a knock. Willem had been knocked on plenty of doors in his time, and had had plenty of doors knocked on in return. And he understood the physics and the social grammar of knocking well enough to say with confidence that what happened to his front door at approximately 8:17 in the evening was not, by any reasonable definition, a knock. It was impact. It was the specific sound and sensation of something very large making contact with a surface that had not been designed with that scale of contact in mind. A single point of pressure, concentrated and immense, that traveled from the door through the frame, through the walls, and into the floor of the room and up through the legs of Willem's armchair and into Willem himself, so that the whole cottage shuddered once, briefly, like an animal twitching in sleep. The teapot on the kitchen shelf fell over. Willem heard it without turning around. He sat for a moment in the aftermath of the knock, the blanket still across his knees, the book still closed on the side table where he'd set it earlier, and he thought about what a man his age, alone in a cottage at the edge of a village on a night when the sky was performing impossible things, ought to do when something that large requested entry. He thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he set the blanket aside, placed his feet in his slippers, straightened up with the particular care that 60 years of living required of a man's back in the evenings, and walked to the front door. He shot back the bolt. He turned the handle. He pulled the door open against the wind, which pushed back with genuine hostility, and he stood in the doorway with the storm roaring around him, and his slippers getting wet and the colored lightning throwing everything into strange, shifting relief, and he looked at what was on the other side of his threshold. He found a dragon. It took Willem's mind a moment to organize what his eyes were giving it. The brain, he had discovered at various points in his life, has a strong preference for the expected. It will work very hard to fit an incoming image into an existing category before it will agree to open a new one. So for just a second or two, standing in his doorway, he found himself performing small, unconscious adjustments. Perhaps it was a horse, an unusually large horse caught in the storm, somehow, before his brain conceded the argument and acknowledged what was actually there. It was a dragon. Not a fearsome one. Not the dragons of the stories he had read by lamplight as a boy, those vast and terrible creatures that lived in the deeper parts of the old tales like dark water under ice, creatures of scorched cities and devoured nights and hoarded gold, ancient and malevolent and enormous beyond comprehension. Those dragons were forces of nature dressed in the clothing of animals, catastrophes with wings, and they announced themselves with fire and ruin. This one was young. Young in the way that changed everything about it. Young in the way that made the enormous slightly ridiculous and the frightening strangely tender. It was, in terms of sheer physical scale, still an extraordinary thing, larger than any horse, about the size of the dray horses the mill used for heavy hauling, though built along entirely different lines. But the youth of it was evident in a dozen ways that Willem took in all at once with the rapid, involuntary assessment that the situation demanded. The proportions were slightly off, the head a fraction too large for the neck, the wings, folded now, pressed so tightly against its body that the membranes trembled, not quite filled out to their full adult span, the way a puppy's paws are too large for the rest of it. The scales, which in an adult dragon of the tailies would have been described as impenetrable armor, each one fitted precisely against its neighbors in a seamless and terrible integument, were here still carrying the slight overlap and inconsistency of immaturity, the blue of them deep and genuine, the deep blue of a winter sky just before full dark, shot through with faint iridescence, but not yet carrying the full density and sheen that age would bring. The wings were the most telling thing. They were folded against its body with a tightness that was clearly not chosen but compelled, the tightness of something pulling itself in against cold, against exposure, against the particular vulnerability of a creature built for warmth finding itself in the grip of a temperature it could not fight. Every few seconds they shook, the thin membranes vibrating against the creature's sides in a fine, uncontrolled tremor. Its eyes were amber, the true amber of old fossilized resin, deep and layered and lit from within by something that was not quite the reflection of the colored lightning outside. Large, much larger than a horse's eyes, occupying a different proportion of the face, set slightly differently, and in them, as Willem looked up and the dragon looked down, was an expression he recognized without difficulty. It was not ferocity. It was not the ancient cold malevolence of the story dragons. It was not hunger or threat or the terrible blankness of a purely predatory thing. It was exhaustion. It was pain, the specific pain of cold that has gone on long enough to stop feeling like cold and start feeling like a change in the fundamental conditions of existence. And beneath those two things, looking out from behind them the way a person looks out from behind their own suffering, tentative, uncertain, not at all sure of its welcome, was something very like hope. Every few seconds, a small puff of smoke escaped its nostrils. Not billowing, not threatening, tiny, involuntary, the kind of thing a creature does without meaning to, the body's autonomic protest against conditions it was not designed for. The fire in its nature expressing itself in the only way the cold had left available. It was shivering. The whole of it was shivering, not violently, not in the dramatic, convulsive way of a thing at its absolute limit, but in the deep, persistent, systemic way of something that had been cold for too long and had expended everything it had in fighting it and had arrived, finally, at the point where the fight was going out of it whether it wished that or not. The trembling moved through it in waves, starting somewhere deep in the great chest and radiating outward through the folded wings and down through the heavy tail that curled around its feet on Willem's garden path. And it was this specific, unmistakable, entirely undignified shivering that settled the matter for Willem more completely than any conscious decision could have. He had seen that shivering before. In animals, yes, in the ewe he'd found half buried in a drift one February morning, in the old sheepdog at the end of its last winter, but also in people. In his wife in those last weeks, the cold that had seemed to come from somewhere inside her that no blanket could reach. He knew what it meant, he knew what it asked. He stood in the doorway for a long moment with the storm howling around both of them, the rain beginning now in earnest, driving sideways off the moors, and he looked at the dragon and the dragon looked at him, and neither of them moved and the wind screamed between them, and the impossible lightning painted them both in its nameless colors. Willem felt the rain beginning to soak through his cardigan. He looked at the creature, this large, cold, young, frightened, exhausted, shivering creature that had found his door in the worst storm in 60 years, and knocked on it with the specific desperation of something that had run out of other options. And he made the assessment that the situation required, the plain, practical, Willem-shaped assessment that had guided him through 60 years of difficult mornings. It was cold, it was in trouble, it had asked for help in the only way available to it. His living room was warm. The rest of it, the scales, the wings, the amber eyes, the whole extraordinary impossibility of what he was looking at was detail. Important detail, the kind that would require management and thought, but detail nonetheless. Secondary to the primary fact, which was simple enough, something was suffering on his doorstep in a terrible storm, and he had a warm room. Willem reached out and took hold of the door, bracing against the wind, which really was quite rude about the whole thing, and pushed it open as wide as it would go. The hinges complaining, the door frame shuddering, the opening suddenly as wide as he could make it in a cottage not designed with this sort of visitor in mind. He looked up at the amber eyes. He said, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and sees no point in dressing it up with more words than the moment requires, "Well, come in then before we both freeze to death." The dragon blinked. It blinked again, the large amber eyes processing something, surprise, perhaps, or the specific disorientation of an outcome you have hoped for but not quite permitted yourself to believe in. Then carefully, with the particular caution of a creature very aware of its own size and very uncertain of the available clearances, it lowered its great head and began, awkwardly, slowly, with considerably more difficulty than the situation might have called for had the doorway been approximately 3 times as wide, to come inside. Willem stood aside to give it room. The rain came in past both of them. The colored lightning fired once more, illuminating the garden path, the gate, the dark hills beyond, before the dragon's bulk moved fully through the threshold and Willem was able to push the door closed against the storm. The wind outside raged on, carrying its deep, impossible sound. Inside, the fire burned, the cider steamed. The shadows in the corners were still deeper than they ought to have been. Willem turned around to survey his living room, which now contained, in addition to his usual furniture and accumulated life of 60 years, a dragon. There was, he thought, quite a lot of reorganization ahead. He pushed his sleeves up and began. A night by the fires. It took some doing. That was the plain way to put it, and Willem was a man who preferred the plain way. It took some doing, and the doing of it occupied the better part of 40 minutes. And by the end of it, Willem's back was making its feelings known in the emphatic language that backs employ when a 60-year-old man has spent 40 minutes doing things that a 30-year-old man would have found challenging. And the living room looked substantially different from how it had looked at the beginning of the evening, and there was a dragon in it. The bookshelf went first, and not by anyone's intention. The dragon had managed the doorway with the focused, effortful care of a creature deeply aware that the situation required it, folding and angling and adjusting in ways that suggested an intelligence actively engaged with a spatial problem rather than simply a large animal forcing itself through a gap. But the living room, once gained, presented a new and more complex set of negotiations. The cottage had been built for a single man of ordinary dimensions and his ordinary life, and the accumulated geometry of that life. The armchair, the side table, the low bookshelf along the inner wall, the footstool, the wooden chest that Willem used for extra blankets, the small round table by the window that held his lamp and his reading glasses, and the particular arrangement of books in progress that he maintained with the casual precision of long habit, had over the years settled into a configuration that used the available space quite thoroughly. The dragon's tail, sweeping once in what Willem would later conclude had been an involuntary gesture of relief at being out of the wind, connected with the bookshelf at approximately the third shelf from the bottom with a force that was not enormous by dragon standards, but was more than sufficient by bookshelf standards. The shelf did not so much fall as it made a rapid decision to become horizontal, depositing its contents: 24 volumes, a ceramic pot that had held pencils, a small framed drawing of a view Willem had liked enough to purchase at a village fair 11 years ago, and a quantity of accumulated dust, across the floor in a fan-shaped arrangement that covered most of the space between the fireplace and the kitchen doorway. Willem looked at the books on the floor. He looked at the dragon, whose amber eyes had gone very wide and very still in the specific expression of someone who has broken something and is waiting to find out how bad the consequences will be. "It's all right," Willem said, in exactly the tone he would have used if a visiting neighbor had knocked over a cup. "Watch your feet." He began moving books. The dragon watched him, motionless, the amber eyes tracking his movements with a concentrated attention that had something guilty in it, the large head lowered slightly on the long neck in a posture that required no particular expertise in dragon reading to interpret. Willem stacked the books in two piles against the far wall, retrieved the pencil pot unbroken mercifully, and the framed drawing, the glass cracked neatly along one corner, but the drawing itself intact, and set both on the mantelpiece for now out of the way. The bookshelf itself he dragged, with some effort, flat against the wall beside the door. It was old and it had survived, listing only slightly to one side in a way that suggested it might have needed the intervention eventually regardless. "Right," he said. "Now then, can you?" He made a gesture, both hands moving, indicating the general area of the living room floor and the dragon's current position within it, which was somewhat diagonal and not quite committed to any particular arrangement. "Can you settle down low, like yes, there?" The dragon, following the gesture with an attentiveness that confirmed Willem's growing suspicion that it understood rather more than it could express, lowered itself carefully to the floor. This process involved the tail again, and Willem moved the remaining chair, a wooden one he had always found uncomfortable, and had kept only out of the vague sense that two chairs were more correct than one, out of its path before it could find the chair on its own. The chair he moved to the kitchen. He thought about it for a moment and left it there permanently. The broken chair, the one that had been in the dragon's path before Willem had thought to move it, was already in several pieces and did not require a decision. Willem gathered the pieces and stacked them by the back door. The wood would be useful. With the dragon finally horizontal, occupying the floor in the way that a very large stone occupies a riverbed, with the settled, weighty permanence of something that has found its level, Willem stepped back and examined the situation. The living room was now arranged around the dragon the way a conversation arranges itself around the person with the most important thing to say. The armchair was still in its usual position beside the fire, but the fire was now also the dragon's fire, and the dragon was between the chair and the door, and the whole room had reoriented itself, had accepted its new center of gravity, and was simply getting on with being the room that contained these things. Willem put his hands on his hips and nodded once. Then he went to deal with the fire. The fire had dropped while the reorganization was in progress, the coals settling and dimming in the way of an untended fire not out, but no longer the confident roar that the evening called for. Willem crouched before it with the poker and the tongs and worked it back up methodically, adding the larger pieces from the basket, adjusting the arrangement with the care of a man who had built thousands of fires and understood that a fire, like most things, benefits from being taken seriously. He built it until it roared, until the heat came off it in visible waves and the light it threw filled the room properly, reaching all the way to the walls, driving the deep shadows back into the corners where they sulked and diminished. He wanted the room hot. He understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with any particular knowledge of dragons, and everything to do with 60 years of watching cold living things try to get warm, that what was on his floor needed heat the way a drowning creature needs air, not as comfort, but as survival. He could hear the shivering in the quality of the dragon's breathing. It had slowed from the desperate, rapid flutter of something at its limit to something more measured, the beginning of a creature that has come inside out of a terrible cold and is beginning, only beginning, to feel the edges of warmth. But the deep trembling continued, moving through the great scaled body in slow waves, and each wave was a reminder of how cold it had got, how long it had been cold, how much warmth was owed to it before the account would balance. Willem built the fire until it was as large as the grate could responsibly accommodate. Then he went to the blanket chest. He had 7 blankets in the chest, the old patchwork one that had been his wife's, 3 wool ones of varying age and weight, 2 that had been purchased for the spare bed that no one had slept in for years, and one very old one of his mother's that he had kept for reasons that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with the fact that it had been his mother's. He took them all out. He stood with the stack of them in his arms and looked at the dragon on his floor, thinking about coverage, about the surface area of the creature relative to the combined area of 7 blankets, doing the informal mathematics of care. He draped them over the dragon's back without any ceremony or internal debate about whether they would come back in good condition. The largest wool blanket went first, across the widest part of the back and over the folded wings. The others he layered and arranged as best he could, tucking where tucking was possible, draping where it wasn't, until the dragon was covered from the base of its neck to somewhere past the midpoint of its body in as many layers of wool and patchwork as Willem had available. The dragon was very still during this process. Its eyes tracked him, followed his movements as he moved around it, noted each blanket as it settled, watched his hands, but it did not move, did not flinch, did not react in any way that suggested the touch of the blankets was unwelcome. If anything, the reverse. When the old patchwork quilt, the heaviest of them, the most substantial, went across the central mass of it, there was a shift in the quality of the creature's stillness, something that moved through it from the inside, subtle and deep, like the movement of water under ice. Willem patted the top of the blanket pile in the same way he had patted the flank of many cold animals over the years, with the same intent and the same matter-of-factness, and went to the kitchen to heat the broth. The broth was leftover from 2 days prior, a good vegetable stock he had made from the end-of-season root vegetables that needed using, with barley and the last of the dried herbs from the garden shelf, and he had been eating it in portions over the week with the modest, unsentimental pleasure of a man who knows how to feed himself without fuss. He ladled his portion into his bowl first, standing at the stove, and ate it there at the kitchen counter, standing up, which he permitted himself when the hour was late and the circumstances were unusual, and then he put the rest of the pot back on the heat and let it come back up to a proper temperature before he carried it, using both hands and moving carefully past the dragon's tail and around the settled mass of it, to the floor near the great lowered head. He set the pot down on the hearthstone where it would stay warm and positioned it as close to the dragon's nose as seemed reasonable. Then he stepped back. He genuinely did not know whether dragons drank broth. It was not a question he had ever had cause to consider, and he had no reference material available at this hour. And in any case, reference material on the dietary habits of dragons was not a section that the village lending library, good as it was for a village of its size, had ever prioritized. He had heated it because it was warm and it was what he had, and it seemed better than doing nothing. And if the dragon declined it, he would be no worse off than before. The dragon considered the pot for a moment. Its nostrils widened slightly, an intake of information, the smell of it being assessed by whatever process a dragon used to assess such things. Then slowly, with a care that suggested it was managing its own movements very deliberately, it lowered its head further and drank the broth. Not delicately. The pot was not large enough for the scale of the creature and the logistics were imperfect, but it managed, tongue and lips working in a way that Willem watched with frank interest. And it took all of it down to the barley settled at the bottom, and then it raised its head again and looked at Willem with the amber eyes that had, he thought, shifted somewhat in quality. The wariness was still there, the deep exhaustion still visible in the slight heaviness of the lids, but something else had joined them, something quiet and specific and directed at him. Willem took the pot back to the kitchen and washed it and put it on the rack and returned to his armchair. They settled into the night together, the old man and the young dragon, in the way that 2 creatures sharing a warm space against a cold and difficult world outside will sometimes settle into a companionable quiet that requires no words and no particular negotiation. The storm continued. Outside, the impossible lightning still fractured the sky in its nameless colors, and the wind still carried its deep, mournful sound, and the rain drove against the windows in waves. But inside, the fire roared and the blankets held their warmth, and the broth sat in the dragon's belly, and the room had achieved the particular quality of insideness that is most felt when the outside is at its most hostile. Willem read for a while, or he held his book and looked at the words on the page, and sometimes the words went in and became meaning and sometimes they did not, because part of his attention was elsewhere, cataloging the sounds of the creature on his floor, tracking the rhythm of its breathing, noting the frequency and intensity of the shivering as the hours passed. He was not anxious. He was attending. There was a difference, and he had learned it long ago. The dragon, for its part, watched him. This was not the watching of something assessing a threat. Willem had seen that in animals and people, in the occasional interaction with someone new who hadn't yet decided whether he was safe, and it had a specific quality, a forward-leaning attention, a reading of exits. This was different. The amber eyes, when Willem looked up from his book and found them on him, had the quality of something trying to understand, trying to place into a known framework a thing it had not encountered before. Willem, with his blankets and his broth and his matter-of-fact decency, was apparently something the dragon was working to make sense of. Willem looked back at it without particular self-consciousness and turned his page. Around 10 o'clock he made himself a cup of tea, and while he was in the kitchen he heated a second pot of water and brought it out in the deep roasting pan, the largest vessel he owned that could be carried full without incident, and placed it on the hearthstone as he had placed the broth. The dragon looked at it, then it drank it. Willem nodded and went back to his chair. The hours moved in the way of hours that contain something extraordinary but are made of ordinary minutes. The fire needed tending twice, and Willem tended it. A gust of particular violence made the chimney moan somewhere around 11, and both of them looked at the ceiling for a moment before the sound passed. The blanket slid from the dragon's back once, the old patchwork one, down the far side, and Willem got up without particular comment and replaced it. And the amber eyes tracked him the whole time with the same focused, trying to understand attention. Somewhere around midnight, the storm began to soften. Not to stop, it would not stop entirely until the gray hours before dawn, but to ease, the way an argument eases when the worst of it has been said and both parties are beginning to tire of the intensity. The lightning became less frequent and its colors less impossible, settling into something closer to ordinary electrical discharge, blues and whites rather than the uncategorizable shades of the earlier hours. The wind dropped from its roaring to a low, continuous moan that was almost companionable by comparison. The rain continued steadily, but without the driving, horizontal fury of the peak. It was in this softening that the dragon finally stopped shivering. It was not a sudden thing. It happened gradually, the deep trembling running through the body in waves that came further and further apart, like the intervals between swells on a calming sea, until Willem, watching over the top of his book, realized that the last interval had been very long indeed, and the wave had not come, and he looked at the creature properly and saw that it had stilled. The breathing had slowed. The great chest rose and fell with the deep regularity of a creature that had moved from the shallow, effortful breathing of distress into the slower rhythms of genuine rest. The wings, still folded against its sides but no longer clamped with the desperate tightness of before, had settled into a more natural position. The tail, which had held its slight curl of tension all evening, lay fully relaxed, its tip just touching the base of the far wall. The amber eyes were closing. Not all at once. Slowly, with the specific gravity of exhaustion that has finally found its permission, the lids descending in stages, opening again once, twice, smaller each time, the light behind them dimming not with defeat but with the deep relief of something that has held on long enough and can now, at last, let go. Willem watched the eyes close fully. He waited a moment, listening to the breathing, confirming its steadiness, its depth. Then he set his book down on the side table, picked up his blanket, and pulled it across his own knees. He sipped the last of his cider. It had gone cold, but he didn't mind cold cider. He looked at the fire, still burning well, still giving out its steady heat, and then he looked at the blanketed shape of the sleeping dragon on his floor, and he felt the day's weariness settling properly into his bones, the particular tiredness that comes not from doing too much but from doing exactly what was necessary. He closed his own eyes. What Willem did not know, what he had no way of knowing, having no access to the internal histories of kingdoms and no particular reason to be aware of the political and symbolic architecture of Caldenmore, was that the creature asleep on his living room floor was not simply a lost young dragon caught in a bad storm. Its name was Shivering. It was the youngest of the 3 royal dragons of the kingdom of Caldenmore, youngest by nearly 40 years, which in dragon terms placed it still firmly in the early stages of its life, and it was bonded by an oath of such antiquity that no living scholar could trace it to its source. The bond was not metaphorical. It was not the pleasant ceremonial language of a kingdom that liked to think of itself as allied with dragons. It was a genuine and binding thing, woven into the legal and spiritual architecture of Caldenmore across 6 centuries of monarchy, renewed at each coronation with specific and demanding ritual, and it meant, in practical terms, that Seravin's well-being was inseparable from the stability of the crown itself. When a royal dragon was sick, the kingdom felt it in ways that ranged from the atmospheric to the constitutional. When a royal dragon was dying, there was no comfortable way to put this, and the kingdom's historians, who had addressed it in their accounts of 2 such previous occasions, had not found one. The effects were not figurative. Seravin had been separated from its escort 3 days before the storm. The mountains to the north of Caldenmore were not, in late autumn, a forgiving environment for anything, and the mission that had taken the escort, 6 riders, two senior court officials, and Saravin, into them had underestimated both the speed at which the season was closing and the specific quality of the storm system that would arrive. When the storm had come down from the high passes with a ferocity and a character that the court's weather readers had not predicted and could not fully account for, the escort had scattered, separated in the white confusion of it, and Saravin, younger, less experienced in mountain flying than its two elder counterparts would have been, injured in the right wing early in the chaos by a collision with an outcrop it had not seen until too late, had come down on the wrong side of the range and had been alone since. 3 days of cold at high altitude, 3 days of an injured wing that would not support sustained flight, 3 days of gradually depleting reserves of warmth, of energy, of the deep internal fire that a dragon requires to maintain its temperature in the way that mammals require food, not optional, not comfort but biological necessity. In the lower valleys the temperature had been survivable. In the open moorland, as the storm descended, it had not been. Saravin had walked on the ground, which was not a thing royal dragons did with any dignity or by any preference, because the wing would not hold the air for long enough to matter, and had been walking for most of the last day, and the cold had been winning for the last several hours, and the light in the window of a small cottage at the edge of a village had been the only light visible in any direction when the strength to continue walking had become a question rather than a certainty. By the time the amber eyes had looked down at the old man in the doorway, Saravin had perhaps 1 more hour, perhaps less. The cold had reached the depth in its body where the fire at its core, the fire that was not metaphor, the fire that was as biological as a heartbeat, was burning very small indeed, a pilot light in a storm, and a pilot light in a storm has only one direction of travel if the storm is not interrupted. The storm had been interrupted by an old man in wet slippers who had looked at the situation plainly and found it, on balance, simple. By morning, the fire in Saravin's chest burned steadily. The wing, rested and warm, had begun its own slow process of repair. The deep cold had retreated from its bones. The broth, humble vegetable made with dried herbs from a shelf above a kitchen window, sat in its belly with the weight and warmth of something that had arrived at exactly the right moment and in exactly sufficient quantity. Saravin was alive, Saravin was warm. Saravin was whole. And across the living room, in the armchair beside the fire that still burned low and steady against the last of the storm, an old man in a wool blanket slept with the uncomplicated peace of someone who had done what needed doing and found it neither remarkable nor particularly difficult. He slept soundly, as he always slept when the evening had been well spent. Outside, the last of the impossible lightning made one final attempt at the sky and then gave it up entirely, and the dark over Ashwick became the ordinary dark of a night moving toward morning, and the wind sighed itself down to nothing, and everything was quiet. The debt of a kingdom. Willem woke slowly, the way he always woke, not all at once, but in stages, consciousness assembling itself from its overnight dispersal with the unhurried patience of a man who had long ago made peace with mornings. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was still warm, the good residual warmth of a space that had been properly heated and had held it through the night, and the gray light coming through the curtains had the particular quality of early morning after a storm, that clean, rinsed brightness that the sky produces when it has spent itself entirely and is starting fresh. Willem lay for a moment in the armchair with his blanket across his knees and his eyes not quite open, performing the gradual inventory of himself that the morning required. His back predictably had opinions. His neck, from the angle of sleep in a chair not designed for sleeping, had further opinions. His feet in their slippers were warm enough. He opened his eyes. The living room was empty. Not empty in the incomplete way it had been empty last night, before the knock at the door, full of its usual furniture and books and accumulated 60 years of a life. Empty in the specific, conspicuous way of a space from which something very large has recently departed. The blankets were on the floor in a heap near the hearth, the arrangement of them bearing the impression of what had lain beneath them, a shape, a weight, a warmth that had been there and was now not. The roasting pan he had used for water was still on the hearthstone, empty and dry. The knocked-over bookshelf was still flat against the wall where he had dragged it. The books were still in their 2 stacks in the corner. The broken chair was still in pieces by the back door. All of that remained. What had gone was the presence at the center of it, the breathing, the amber eyes, the warm mass of the creature that had reorganized his evening and his living room, and he was beginning to suspect rather more than that. Willem sat with the empty room for a moment and felt something he hadn't anticipated feeling, which was a small, quiet version of loss. It surprised him mildly. He was not generally a man who became attached quickly. He was not cold. He had been told many times over his life that he was not cold, had been told so by his wife with the particular affection of someone who found this worth saying. But he was not quick to attach, and one evening with a creature he had never met and could not speak to ought not to have been sufficient to produce anything resembling loss at its absence. And yet there it was, a small thing. He acknowledged it without drama, the way he acknowledged most things, and then he set it aside and began the process of getting up out of the armchair, which required more negotiation with his back than he would have preferred. He was upright, had made it to standing, and was in the process of deciding whether his first priority was the kettle or the curtains when he became aware of a sound outside. Several sounds, in fact, a collection of sounds that resolved as he stood still and listened into something organized, something moving in number with a purposefulness that had weight and structure to it. He went to the window first and drew the curtain back. Then he stood at the window for a longer moment than he had stood in the doorway the previous night, which was saying something, and looked at what was making its way up his garden path. The procession was not enormous, by the standards of what a kingdom can produce when it applies itself to formality. Willem had no particular baseline for comparison, having never personally received a procession, but he would later be told by the Lord Steward, in one of the many subsequent conversations they would have, conversations that would evolve over the years from official to cordial to something approaching genuine, that it had been assembled with considerable haste and represented the fastest mobilization of royal ceremony that Caldenmore had managed in living memory. It had been assembled, essentially, overnight, in the hours after Saravan had been found and the location of its shelter identified and the full situation understood. And what had been produced in those hours was, the Lord Steward said this with a professional pride he could not entirely suppress, really quite impressive given the constraints. There were soldiers, a column of them in the formal livery of the Caldenmore Royal Guard, which involved a deep blue that was clearly deliberate, that matched, Willem noticed, the color of Saravan's scales and a crest on the breastplate that he couldn't make out at this distance. They moved with the particular posture of soldiers who are performing a ceremony rather than conducting an operation, shoulders back and pace measured, though the garden path was narrow enough that they were obliged to proceed in pairs, which compressed the formalities somewhat. There were advisors, men and women in formal robes of various weights and colors, carrying between them a quantity of scrolls, cases, leather-bound folders, and one elaborately carved wooden box the purpose of which would remain mysterious to Willem for several weeks. They had the look of people who had been awoken at an unusual hour and had dressed with great care in order to compensate for this, and they moved with the slightly rigid dignity of the formally attired who are trying not to let the condition of the garden path. It had not been an ideal path even before a night of heavy rain register on their faces. And there were two dragons. Not young, these two, not the compact, still-growing size of Saravan. These were adult dragons in full maturity, and the difference in scale was significant. They did not fit on the garden path in any conventional sense and had therefore arranged themselves on either side of it, moving through what had been Willem's kitchen garden with the careful deliberateness of very large creatures trying to minimize their footprint, which they were managing imperfectly. Willem noted the loss of the remaining autumn kale with the mild philosophical regret of a man who has learned that some things are not worth the energy of strong feeling, and watched the dragons instead. They were extraordinary. He could admit that without difficulty, standing at his window in his cardigan and slippers. They were extraordinary in the way that certain things are extraordinary, where the word feels simultaneously too large and somehow insufficient. The scales were not blue, these two. One was a deep, burnished bronze that caught the morning light and held it, and one was the dark gray-green of deep water, shot through with something iridescent that shifted as the creature moved. Their eyes, when they turned toward the cottage, were gold and amber respectively, and carried in them the weight of very long lives and the particular composure of creatures that have long since stopped needing to establish themselves. They were also, Willem realized after a moment looking at him. Not at the procession, not at the cottage in general, at him, specifically at the window where he stood in his cardigan with the curtain pulled back. The two adult dragons for just a moment had their attention on the 60-year-old man in the window of the small cottage at the edge of the village of Ashwick, and what was in their gaze was not threatening and not imperious, and not the cold, ancient, unreadable quality he might have expected. It was something more considered than any of those things, and it lasted only a moment before they both moved their attention elsewhere, but Willem felt it and filed it away without entirely knowing what to do with it yet. And then behind all of it, behind the soldiers and the advisors and the adult dragons and the scrolls and the carved box, was Saravan. Willem's first clear sight of the creature in daylight, and without a storm between them, was a different experience from the night before in ways he found himself unprepared for. The night before, he had seen a young, cold, frightened thing at its limit, and he had responded to those qualities to the need of it, and the rest had been secondary. He could admit this honestly, he had not really seen it. He had seen what it needed and provided what he had, and that was a different kind of looking. In the morning light, without the emergency, he saw Saravan. It was sitting, arranged, rather, in the way that a creature chooses to be seen when it is choosing to be seen at the far end of the garden path, where the path met the lane and it was sitting tall. Not with the slightly collapsed, effortful tallness of a creature maintaining a posture it has to work for, but with the easy, natural tallness of something that has recovered its strength and is wearing it without thinking about it. The scales in the morning light were extraordinary. The deep winter sky blue he had noted last night had another layer to it in sunlight, a depth and complexity that the firelight had suggested but not fully revealed, blue running into the faintest traces of something almost violet at the edges of each scale where they overlapped their neighbors. The wings were not fully spread. They were extended was the word, held slightly away from the body, not wide, not the display of threat or dominance that wings spread to their full extent would have represented. Something between resting and deliberate. Something that required, as Willem would indeed later learn from the Lord Steward, a small but specific piece of context to correctly interpret. It was the posture, the particular angle, the particular degree of extension of a dragon showing respect, not submission, not the lowered head tucked-wing posture of a creature acknowledging dominance. Respect, which was an entirely different thing and carried, in the culture and the formal language of the royal dragons of Caldenmore, considerably more weight. The amber eyes found him the moment he appeared in the doorway. The shivering was entirely gone. He had known it would be, had watched it go in the small hours of the night, but seeing its absence in full daylight was its own confirmation, its own distinct thing. The eyes that had watched him last night with the cautious, exhausted wariness of a creature not quite sure of its own survival were the same eyes technically in the same face, but what they were doing was different now. The desperation was gone. The pain was gone. What had replaced them was something he found himself struggling to put into familiar terms. Because the terms he had available were human terms, and he was looking at something that was not human, but was also, unmistakably, doing something that human faces did. It was looking at him with recognition, with the particular quality of attention that passes between two creatures who have shared something real, not a transaction, not a service rendered and received, but something that had happened in the dark and the cold when both of them were, in their different ways, simply being what they were. The amber eyes were steady and clear and warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and they were directed without any ambiguity whatsoever at Willem. He stood in his doorway in his slippers and looked back, and the look that passed between them in that moment had a fullness to it that did not require words and would not have been improved by them. Then the Lord Steward arrived at the door. The Lord Steward of Caldenmore was a man of perhaps 55, with the bearing of someone who has spent decades being the most organized person in every room he enters, and has learned to wear this as a form of armor. He was tall, formally dressed in the kind of clothing that suggested it had never been worn at anything less than full ceremonial attention, and he carried himself with the specific gravity of a man upon whom important things regularly depend and who has made his peace with this. He had the face of someone accustomed to composure. It was a face that had been trained, over many years of service, to maintain its professional register regardless of what it was being asked to look at. The face, when Willem opened the door, was doing its best. It was doing its best in the face of the cottage, which was small. It was doing its best in the face of Willem, who was wearing a cardigan with a loose button and slippers that had seen better years, and who had not yet had his morning tea. It was doing its best in the face of the living room visible behind Willem, with its heaped blankets on the floor and its stacked books in the corner and its broken chair in pieces by the back door and its general air of a space that had been reorganized by necessity and had not yet been reorganized back. It was this face a portrait that Willem read with the ease of a man who had spent 60 years watching people try to manage themselves in situations they hadn't expected. There was relief in it, genuine, deep, the relief of someone who had spent a very difficult night and has arrived at the end of it with the outcome he needed. There was the official gravity of ceremony, of a man who had a role to perform and was performing it with the full weight of its importance. And there was, beneath both of those, looking out from behind the controlled professional surface, with the mild helplessness of something it could not quite suppress, bewilderment. The specific bewilderment of a man who has been looking urgently for the person who saved the life of a royal dragon and has found a cottage of this size and a man in these slippers, and cannot entirely make the two things fit together the way they ought to. "Mr. Willem," the Lord Steward said, with the gravity of a man who is fully aware he is about to say something extraordinary and has been preparing it since before sunrise. "Good morning," said Willems. The Lord Steward unrolled the scroll. It was a very fine scroll. Willem could appreciate that without knowing very much about scrolls. The parchment was the kind that spoke of expense, the edges finished with a precision that suggested considerable care, and the text visible at the top before the Lord Steward began to read was written in a hand that knew exactly what it was doing and wanted you to know it too. The seal at the bottom, Willem caught a glimpse of it. The deep blue wax bore the crest he had seen on the soldiers' breastplates, rendered in full and elaborate detail. The Lord Steward cleared his throat once, a professional clearing. the kind that establishes authority and marks a beginning, and began to read. The ancient laws of the Kingdom of Caldenmore, as they pertain to the preservation of a royal dragon, were not brief. They had been established in the first century of the kingdom's formal existence, and they had been added to and annotated and cross-referenced over the 6th century since, and the Lord Steward read the relevant sections with the full weight and dignity they carried, which was considerable. He read of the bond between the crown and the royal dragons, its history, its legal standing, its implications. He read of the category of person, the specific legal category, with its specific name, its specific precedence that was created by the act of preserving a royal dragon's life. He read this category's name, Friend of the Crown. He explained what Friend of the Crown meant. It meant full protection under royal law, for the remainder of Willem's life, in all matters and in all territories under the Crown's jurisdiction. No legal action could be taken against a friend of the Crown without the Crown's explicit consent, and the Crown's consent was, historically, not forthcoming. It meant a title should Willem wish one. The Lord Steward's tone here was carefully neutral, carrying no judgment about whether a man in these particular slippers would wish a title, though his eyes suggested he had formed a preliminary view. It meant land, a parcel of it, specified in a separate document in one of the leather folders the advisors were carrying. A parcel of genuinely good land with an existing house on it, should Willem wish to relocate, or a pension sufficient to live well on should he prefer to remain where he was. It meant the right to call upon the Crown's aid in any matter, great or small, personal or civic, the Lord Steward repeated, with the emphasis of someone reading a word that has actual legal force for the remainder of his days. It meant all of this bound by oath and law and the authority of the current monarch, binding without exception on all future monarchs in perpetuity, his claim registered permanently in the royal archives and honored without question from this day forward. The Lord Steward finished reading. He held the scroll at the slight angle that indicated it remained available for review. He looked at Willem with the expression of a man who has just delivered something remarkable and is waiting for a response commensurate with its remarkableness. Willem listened to all of it. He listened carefully, as he always listened, with the full attention of a man who believes that things said deserve to be properly heard. He let the Lord Steward finish entirely before he did anything else. Then he scratched the back of his neck, the gesture he made when he was thinking about something practical, when his mind was already moving from the thing just said toward the next necessary thing. And he looked at the Lord Steward, and at the advisors behind him on the path with their folders and their cases, and at the soldiers, and past all of them at the 2 adult dragons and the remnants of his kitchen garden, and at Saravan beyond the gate, amber eyes warm in the morning light. There were a great number of them. They had come a long way at some speed by the look of it. The storm had been very bad, and the morning was only just beginning, and the nearest inn in Ashwick did not open until 9. "Have any of you eaten?" Willem asked. "I've got eggs. The bread from yesterday's still good enough if it's toasted. It won't stretch to all of you," he added honestly, looking at the assembled procession with the practical eye of a man assessing quantities. "But I can do something for the people at the front, and there's a woman 3 doors down who does a very good breakfast if someone wants to knock on her door. She won't mind. Tell her it's Willem that sent you." The silence that followed this was complete. It lasted for several seconds, covering the assembled soldiers and advisors and the Lord Steward himself. And in the silence the morning held its quality, the clean, rinsed quiet of after-storm birdsong beginning somewhere in the hedgerow, the sound of the lane still wet and settling. Then from behind the gate, from the tall and gleaming and wing-extended shape of Saravan, came a sound. It was low, it was rolling. It moved through the air the way certain sounds do, not loudly but pervasively, reaching everywhere at once into the ears and the chest, into the specific frequency that the body recognizes before the mind does. It was warm, was the most accurate word for it, warm in the way that a fire in a cold room is warm, radiating from its source with an easy generosity that had nothing to do with effort. Every person in the garden recognized it. The soldiers, whose training covered formal dragon protocol in more theoretical than experiential terms, recognized it from their training. The advisors, who had worked in proximity to the royal dragons for years, recognized it with the ease of long familiarity. The 2 adult dragons, bronze and green-gray in the morning light, both turned their great heads toward Saravan briefly, then turned them back. And if dragons could be said to smile, and there were those in Caldenmore who would have said so, who had studied the question with some seriousness, they did something in that direction. The Lord Steward recognized it immediately. He had served the crown for 30 years and had been in the presence of the royal dragons for most of that time, and he knew that sound the way he knew his own name. It was laughter. A dragon laughing, not at anyone, not unkindly, but with the full and genuine warmth of a creature that has just encountered something it finds completely and entirely wonderful. The Lord Steward stood in the garden path of the small cottage at the edge of Ashwick with his formal scroll, and his composed professional face, and the weight of 6 centuries of royal law in his hands. And something in his chest did something that was not entirely consistent with the dignity of his office. He looked at the man in the cardigan and the slippers, who was looking back at him with the patient, practical expression of someone who has made an offer and is waiting politely to find out if it's been accepted. He rolled the scroll up. He rolled it carefully, with the respect the document deserved, and he tucked it under his arm, and he looked at Willem for a moment longer with an expression that had abandoned its complicated portrait and become something simpler, something, if Willem had been pressed to name it, that was in the vicinity of recognition. Of one person seeing something true about another and finding it, against all formal expectation, exactly right. "Thank you," the Lord Steward said. "Breakfast would be very welcome." The kingdom of Caldenmore had incurred debts across the 6 centuries of its existence, and it had honored them with varying degrees of consistency depending on the monarch and the circumstance. It had been in the debt of generals who had held the northern border in winters that should have broken it. It had been in the debt of sorcerers who had done things that the histories recorded in careful, circumspect language that implied the full details were not for general circulation. It had been in the debt of warriors, diplomats, scholars, and on one memorable occasion, a shepherd's daughter who had done something with a river that the current histories still debated. These debts it had honored in the grand manner, in the way that kingdoms honor the debts incurred by grand things, with ceremony and title and the formal weight of public acknowledgement, the kind of repayment that is itself a story, that adds to the kingdom's legend as it discharges its obligation. The debt it incurred on the night of the impossible storm in the village of Ashwick in a cottage of modest dimensions, this debt it repaid differently. It repaid it in the way that Willem, if he had been asked, which he was not, would have preferred, quietly, consistently, without ceremony after the first morning which had ceremony enough. It repaid it in the form of the pension that appeared reliably in the arrangement the Lord Steward established before he left, in the protection that was never needed but was always there. Willem felt it occasionally, in the way that one feels the presence of a wall one cannot see but knows to be standing, and in the visits. The visits were not official, they were not recorded in any document. They were simply something that happened once a season at first, then more frequently than with the comfortable irregularity of something that occurs when it occurs because both parties find it agreeable rather than because a schedule demands it. A particular blue shape appearing on the lane in the early morning, a sound against the door that was not quite a knock, the familiar business of reorganizing the living room, the broth. The blankets, 2 creatures sharing a warm space against the cold, each in its own chair, or the dragon equivalent of a chair, which was the living room floor, and which Saravin had made its own so thoroughly over the years that there was a permanent impression in the flagstones that Willem never saw any reason to address. 40 years is a long time. It is long enough for a young dragon to grow less young, for an old man to grow older, for a kingdom to cycle through its business and its difficulties and its recoveries, for the debt between them to become something that the word debt no longer captures, something that has passed through obligation and out the other side into the territory of things freely given, freely received, freely continued because both parties have long since forgotten how to imagine the alternative. The debt of a kingdom, repaid in full, and then continued because some things, once begun, discover that they were never really about the debt at all.